So welcome. Thanks for joining us for Keys to Unlocking Treasures of Academic Content. And this is one of a series of webinars that we do to support implementation of the college and career readiness standards. We've had one already. We'll have another one later this spring, and we are so glad to have a handful of panelists with us this afternoon to help us dig into this important topic. So I'm Patsy. I direct Atlas here at Hamline University, and this is a topic close to my heart. We're excited to learn from several of our practitioners from around the state this afternoon. Our objectives this afternoon are the following. We're going to engage with a handful of our adult education colleagues on our webinar, and we're going to identify some really concrete strategies that help students access academic language and content across multiple subject areas. So no matter what you teach, you are going to find something of use today for sure. And then we'll have some thoughts on how you might incorporate one or more of these strategies into your instruction. So plenty of opportunities for interaction this afternoon. So our agenda this afternoon, some introductions, then time with each of the panelists, and then some wrap up. So the key question that we posed to our panelists as we were designing this session, and by we, I mean Lindsay Hoost and Christine Kelly were really doing the heavy lifting here. What are some strategies you use to include academic language and content in your instruction? And so the rationale behind this, I won't read it all to you, but I want to just give you a sense of how this particular design of this webinar came to be. We have some undergirding beliefs, some assumptions that we have about academic language and content. And one is that all learners should be able to access academic content. It doesn't not just those students that come to us saying, I want to do this degree at this college. It is, in fact, all learners should be able to access that. We don't know what our students will do next, and it is actually not up to us to make that decision. It is ours to give them the access to do whatever is next in their lives, whether it's now or 6 months from now or 6 years from now. So we believe our students are able to do that. And with that assumption, we need to give them the keys to be able to do that. And we see our students through that asset-based lens. All of our students are capable of doing this work. And if we don't hold that to be true, we cannot do the work. So in that vein, we want our learners to develop independence, right? We can't be with them all the time. Adult life requires the ability to read texts with more complex language structures than perhaps are presented in teacher-generated materials, sometimes in textbooks that are traditionally created for our learners. Multilingual learners may be highly educated in their home countries, but may need academic language and academic content in English to continue with a particular career pathway. So these are some of the assumptions that we hold dear as we move through this work. Our panelists, oh, you are in good hands this afternoon. We have our lead ASL teacher from Literacy Minnesota, Jessica Jones, who has presented for us many a time. We're glad to have her with us. Dr. Kori McKibben is joining us as well, a GED teacher from Suburban Adult Education. Thanks for joining us, Kori. Also, Susan Clark, a GED teacher from Metro North. Thanks for joining us, Susan. Also has presented on science in particular comes to mind. And you may also know Amber Delliger, math instructor at Metro North and Oka Ramsey Community College on all things math and more. Amber has joined us over the years. So you are in excellent hands this afternoon. We're so glad to have you all with us. Thank you for saying yes when it's so much easier to say no in a busy time in your lives and in your work lives. So thank you so much. We're glad to have you. And we're going to start with Jess. So thank you, Jessica. And we are eager to hear everything you have to tell us.
Thanks, Patsy.
Absolutely.
Jessica Jones. I'm joining you from the east side of St. Paul, where I teach for Literacy Minnesota. I have been, in the past year, jumping around and teaching all different kinds of levels, sort of filling in as we transition a number of staff. So I've been teaching everything from beginning literacy all the way up to college prep this year. Thankfully, not in the same class. So let's see. Yeah, so let me talk about the challenge that brought on this, this strategy. And that was, I had a lot of learners say something that probably feels familiar to many of you, which is, I understand what this word means. We've done a lot of vocabulary work on it, or I know it already, but when I try to use it in my writing or speaking, I don't know how. I don't really know when it's appropriate to use it or how to fit it into the grammatical structure of the sentence. Go ahead and click on the next one. And again, there we go. So the strategy that we started using on a regular basis was introducing an online co-location dictionary, which up until a few years ago was not a thing that I even knew existed. I think if you click one more time there, there we go. So a co-location dictionary does not give us definitions. So again, this is a strategy to use after students have developed an understanding of the word's meaning. This is a dictionary that provides a list of words that commonly occur together. In other words, they are co-located. And it gives example sentences for those words. Let's take a look at what it looks like. Go ahead and click on the next slide. There we go. So the one that I use the most is called osdic.com. It appears, the name appears up at the top there. When you do a search, like I've done here, this is a screenshot for the word access, it will show you all of the forms of the word that it has available in its dictionary. So that's what those green words up at the top are: access, accessible, accessory, inaccessible. All of those are links that you could click on to see examples with that form of the word. And to give you an idea, this is again helping us think about what are the words that most often appear with access. The verbs we use, we tend to talk about having access, gaining access, getting access, or giving access. And so what we did in our class was begin to introduce this kind of dictionary. What kind of information is it showing? And how can we use it? And so we started doing, this was for an online class, we started doing a little routine where we would take a word that we had worked on previously that I felt confident students knew the meaning of, and I would just pull up the page in that dictionary, maybe zoom into one part of the entry like this is, and I would ask students to start writing sentences in the chat. Let's pick, and a lot of times I said, you might not know what all these words mean, right? You might not know what deny or restrict mean, but you know what give means. So let's try a sentence with give access. Let's try a sentence with provide access. And so it started to give them a structure to build their own sentences, but it wasn't quite as limiting as like a sentence frame might be. This is down here where it talks about the prepositions. This is also something that students from beginning to advanced levels still struggle with, which prepositions go with which key vocabulary. So we also spent some time talking about looking at the example. So improved access for disabled visitors. And then I might say, okay, let's pay attention to what comes after the for. Is it a person? Is it a place? How do we want to describe this? So we talked about for going with people or groups, and then to, access to the medical records. So helping to differentiate when we're going to use for and when we're going to use to. And then from there, they just put sentences into the chat, and the volunteers and I provided feedback on those. And I saw a lot of growth in their sentence writing, just with this very simple, like literally zero prep activity. All right, Patsy, if you can go ahead and click on to the next slide. Oh yeah, there is the website address up there. It is just osdic.com. And then, okay, so how we've used it, go ahead and click through there. Right, so in addition to working with students, I also use this as a resource for myself when I'm getting ready to introduce a new vocabulary word. So I don't use it with the students right away if it's a new word, but I might use it with myself to think about what are the important contexts and sort of grammatical features that go with this word that I want to be sure to introduce when I'm introducing the word. So it helps me as a resource for kind of my planning about what I'm going to say about this word or how to use it. And then, as I mentioned, after the students and I have studied the meaning of the word, then go ahead and click. Then we use this dictionary to highlight a specific usage. And then, as I said, practice written examples. And click one more time. Right, okay, good. I've given you my examples of how we've used this. All right, so now we're ready to look at some more examples. Oh, I take that back. Impact. Go ahead and click through. The guidance and structure, as I said, has helped students really own these words so that they are not just able to hear and read these words with understanding, but that they're also really able to integrate them into their own vocabulary for writing and speaking purposes. And that's helping bridge them to that next level of academic discourse. So this is your task now. I want you to think about how could a co-location dictionary be useful in your instruction, either for planning purposes or for an activity with students. And this is one we are going to chat out. So go ahead and think about how might you use a co-location dictionary in your instruction. And Patsy, if you want to click through, there's another example slide. All right, so we'll use this. I've purposely chosen the word vocabulary. So thinking about, this is the entry for the word vocabulary. You can maybe use it as a reference or as a point of inspiration to think about how you might use a co-location dictionary in a classroom or instructional setting. So I'll give you a little time, be quiet now, wait time for you to enter some things in the chat.
You able to see the chat, or do you want me to read
I
anything
am.
else?
Nope, I'll go ahead and get started reading. Good. So yeah, Shannon says to focus on speaking, writing sentences about real world documents, like appointment reminders, job application, notes to teachers. Yeah, I think about things like notes to teachers as, or notes that come home from teachers, as a good example of where academic language really spills into daily life. And so, yeah, that would be a great application. All right, and I see that a co-location dictionary would be extremely helpful with emergent speakers and writers in the jail setting. Oh, that's interesting. If you feel like it, add a little bit more and tell us how that might, what that might look like. And Dan says giving opportunity, additional context to vocabulary word or context personalized to the students. Yeah. Yeah, it is really a tool for adding a level of richness to your vocabulary instruction. I think about, before doing this, I spent some time with my students talking about the difference between receptive vocabulary and productive vocabulary. And we listed off a bunch of strategies that we use sort of on the receptive side when we're trying to figure out what a word means, or what it means in this context, or how to understand its multiple meanings. But then it was the productive side that everyone said, I just don't know, like, what do I do? How do I make this happen? So this was a good concrete way to help people feel like they were building their skills at using the vocabulary. Let's see. Sorry, I'm reading. Okay, great. So yeah, Sarah has shared with us another possible co-location dictionary. Yes, this one does have British spellings rather than American spellings. But as you know, I chose it because of its very clean visual form. All right. Great. Well, again, this is sort of our, this is a quick one tool presentation. And I hope that you take some time to explore it and think about how it might be helpful in your planning or in your direct instruction. And I think, go ahead and click through. There we go. And then I will hand it off to Susan.
Great. Well, thank you. So I am teaching mostly students preparing for the science and social studies GED tests. And I think on the next slide, we can go to, I think I have my topic, yes. So I've been teaching adults for about 2.5 years. So I feel like I'm still on a very steep learning curve. Before that, I taught high school students and I taught high school social studies students, and mostly advanced placement high school social studies students in the southern metro area. And then I lived during the COVID lockdown years in Washington, D.C., and I came back to Minnesota and I wanted to try something. I needed a little more to do. So I started teaching GED science, but science is very new to me. So all of the vocabulary is new to me, and I feel like I've learned at the same time as the people I'm teaching. And I've been I love what I'm doing. I love teaching adults. I've been very surprised about a couple things. One thing is, when I taught high school students, I knew what GED was, but barely. And I thought, I had no idea that it's not easy and that it requires so much critical thinking. And I think it's comparable to advanced placement high school tests on many of the questions. So that the vocabulary part of that is huge to me, especially in science. And I think that about half of the people I'm teaching are the opening slide we had that said highly educated, multilingual adults working on academic vocabulary. That's about exactly half of whom I'm teaching. So I picked for my topic for this, for my little bit of time, something really narrow, which is teaching the idea of the variables in the scientific method. And if we go to the next slide, I took the career and college readiness standard, the little bit of it here that is specific to science vocabulary, where it says determine the meaning of domain-specific words in a text, and then at the end, where I highlighted in red, scientific context. And with scientific method, I have taken every HiSET practice test there is for science and social studies, and I've taken the GED Ready test as a student probably 10 times in my 2 years to figure out what is it that I could do because I've realized it's not what you know, it's how you think. But there's certain vocabulary in science that if you know it, it is going to help you think and do well. So that's how I came to independent and dependent variables. Knowing those will get learners' questions right on the science test. So on the next slide, I teach, I'm very visual. So, and I think most people, most of the learners I'm teaching are visual. So I start with something like this. So thinking about the scientific method, any puzzle that is going to require an experiment requires that you start with a question. So I would show my class, and now I'm showing you this as if you were my class. When you look at this photo of bananas, what is a question that you might have about those bananas? And if anyone would be willing in the chat to put a question that you might ask as if you were a learner in a science class about these bananas. And there's lots of possible questions. Yeah, excellent. Why they're brown? How old are they? How much longer until I can make banana bread? Yeah. Why are they turning brown? Like, great questions. And then the next slide is something similar. Who will eat the bananas? How old? Yeah, those are really good. Or here's a picture of, yeah, next slide with the sunflower. Similar, when you look at this picture of a sunflower, same thing. What's a kind of question that you might have as a curious person about the sunflower? And if you could type anything along those lines in the chat, that will be really helpful. There's, yeah, there we go. Is it a sunflower at a farm or a garden? How tall is it? How much water does it need? Where is it growing? Oh my gosh, these are just really good. What is the center part? Can I map the spirals and the Fibonacci sequence on the center? Oh yeah, turning it into math. Yeah, so okay, great questions. So if we started with a question and then we wanted to know the answer to that question, that would lead me into reviewing with my class, or if they were newer learners and didn't remember scientific method, what you have to do, your question, and then eventually your hypothesis, and then you have to set up your experiment. So I would bring my class in through the photos, and then on the next slide, I would introduce to them definitions of independent and dependent variable. And these are definitions from a scientist. But on the next slide, I have the definitions as I explain them to my class, as I learned them or relearned them just a few years ago. So I think of the dependent variable as what the person doing the experiment is watching. And the independent variable is what the person doing the experiment controls. And those are definitely the simplest way to think about them, but it is something that a person who's learning it, or a person who's working on English, or I have a student right now who has quite a bit of education in another country, in Egypt, but is English. When he went to high school, he only got to study technical machines. And so he's never learned this. And so it's both the vocabulary and the language. And something like this is overwhelming to him. But when he sees it this simple, then he can process it. So then on the next slide, and I'm doing this much faster. I would have more examples and it would be, but for you, faster. So then I would have some examples like this. If our question that we asked is what happens when puppies take vitamins, and then we came up with the hypothesis that puppies that are given vitamins gain more weight. And so we set up an experiment around that hypothesis. What would our independent variable be and what would our dependent variable be? So I would ask you to think, well, what would you be watching for? That would be your dependent variable. And if you would think like an adult learner learning this, what might you say, and would you put that in the chat? What would you be watching for if you did this experiment? Great. Nice, thank you. So we would watch our independent variable. On the next slide, I typed how I would explain it. Our independent variable would be the vitamins, and our dependent variable would be the weight gain. So then Very nice, thank you. And then on our next slide, then I might give a little more detailed scenario and have a chart like this. And we just did this in a class the week before last, and I had a bunch of examples. And so this is just an example. If a scientist wanted to know how much salt in water determines whether or not eggs will float. And so we set up 3 bowls of equal amounts of water. And in one bowl we put salt, and in we put a teaspoon, and in one we put a tablespoon of salt, and one was just water. And then we put eggs in each of them. And then I would ask my class, what's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? I would have also introduced control group and experimental group. And I might show several examples like this. And then on the next slide, they might write down, or on a whiteboard or whatever method, a Jamboard, but they would write down the amount of salt is independent, and what the scientist watches for dependent would be whether the egg floats. So I just walk around thinking, what questions do I have about things in my kitchen, in real life, about my own dogs, come up with questions and set or test scores or anything that you might be able to test in an experiment. And then I make some scenarios like this. Okay, then on the next slide, I then, to practice it, created a word wall activity. And I didn't know if you use word wall or don't use word wall. I was introduced to it about a year ago, and I really, really like it. So it's free. It's free. You can have 5 activities at a time in your word wall account. You can have students try it, unlimited. There's not a limit. Anybody, any kind of device can open it. It seems to be very user friendly. The only disadvantage is, unlike Jamboard, where I can click through if I've given everyone a slide and see what they're doing. In WordWall, they go and do it and then have to report back. But I made this up, kind of silly maybe, examples of practicing dependent and independent variable for just one more way to come back at those words. And we can put the link for you. It is in the chat, and you can try my WordWall activity. My class did this very one. There are 10, and you certainly just give it a try and click through a couple. Let's see, we have a couple minutes left for you to try. Like if you try it for a minute or two, and then come back and let us know that in the chat that you've tried it. Oh, okay, thanks, Lindsay. She said you can give it a try. The only thing another interesting thing about WordWall is to make it free and accessible to everyone, you publish it, and then I think you can do searches for topics. So most of my activities, no one has ever tried, but once in a while, I'll look at it, lists a leaderboard, and I'll see all these names of kids' first names that I've never heard of. So they are out there and people can try them. And then my hope is that with this very specific vocabulary, if I keep coming back to it in different ways, in all of these different ways, through visual, through official definition, through making and filling in a chart, through trying an activity that are, I hope, engaging, that the definitions stick. And actually some of my learners, they just have been there a long time. And I am 100% sure that they know how to apply this vocabulary when they do more complicated GED questions. If you haven't ever tried or heard of WordWall, I paid $9 a month for it, and it gives me more activities, and I can have an unlimited amount. and because I use it so much, it's well worth it to me. There are all kinds of, there's so many different ways that you can do it. You can do categories, you can do drag and drop kinds of things, you can do things with pictures. I've done things with, I did a thing with where the world's deserts were, wondering if they knew. So I was able to put a map in and they can drag a line to where we were doing an activity about one of the deserts. So this is just one way to use it. So Lindsay, I've been going for about 14 minutes. Should we try to get people to come back and then do the, how it could be applied?
Yeah, we can start wrapping up. You have a couple minutes left.
Okay. I put my timer on because I had no idea. I was practicing how long this would take me, but I was practicing on a puppy. He wasn't the best participant. So on my next slide, I think I just have the question of how, I know that not everyone is teaching GED science, but do you think with vocabulary, or do you think with what you saw in WordWall, or what you, anything that you saw that you would be able, and you can say or not say, but when I go to these, I always try to think, is there a way I could take this and make it work for what I'm doing? For reading, yeah. I think it's really interesting, Lindsay. I agree with you. What I've learned in my experience, my limited experience, is that it's not at all how much you know, but there are certain things that if you know, will pay off. And this is definitely two of the words that seem to me they'll pay off if you understand this. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Susan. All right, we will move to Kori.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Kori McKibben, and I teach GED classes in South Suburban ABE. I have the one-room schoolhouse, so I have all different levels. And while most of my students are focused on taking their GED test, I do have some students who are just back brushing up on skills so that they can take post-secondary training or advance in their career and things like that. So I have a little bit of every situation in my class. And today I'm going to be talking to you about semantic mapping, because we know one way that our brain typically holds information and can like really learn information and retain it is through categorizing. And so semantic mapping is a strategy for graphically mapping connections between words. So just as many of you, I have almost 100% of my students are multilingual learners. And so this is a great way to create a visual map. It's very easy, but it focuses on academic vocabulary and the connections between words, which helps with the categorizing and the connections that help us then remember. So it allows students to conceptually explore knowledge of a new word by mapping it with related words or phrases similar in meaning to the new word. You could click. Yep, thank you. So there's three components when we think of a semantic map. First, you're going to want to have a keyword or phrase that is the main focus of the semantic map. And then you're going to think about what are the strands or categories or subcategories that relate to that main topic or that like main word. Then you'll create details, inferences, generalizations, and examples that are related to each strand. So I know I've been using this with, I also teach undergraduates at a Winona State in their teacher ed program. And we've been working on semantic mapping, and they've been struggling with it just a little bit because they're so used to concept mapping that they want to do concept mapping versus really focusing on words and the connection between words. If you could click. So here is what a semantic map could look like. So there's that idea of that keyword being in the middle. And then we have those strands that come off, or those could be like the categories, and then examples coming off of each of those categories or strands. You could click. So here's an example for like types of rocks, right? So if you're teaching science and you're learning about different types of rocks, our theme, our keyword is rocks. And then we can see those categories of sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic. And then again, those very specific word examples that connect to each of those types of rocks. Okay. So sometimes we know it can be really hard for our brains, especially when we're learning about a new topic or a new word and have very heavy academic vocabulary, that it can be hard to like determine the categories or those strands, right? So you can do this in another way that I've used quite often with my students. And that's when we list the keyword and then we list any other words that connect to the keyword. And I like to put them on like Post-it notes, like sticky notes or on index cards. And then that way we're able to sort them out to look for and create categories. So like, oh, these words fit together because they are all sedimentary. These words all fit together because they're igneous. So sometimes having that, I like to use the doc cam if I'm in class or on Zoom. And also you can use Jamboard as well to brainstorm. Okay. So we're actually going to do an example together. So we can pretend like we are in social studies and we have been focusing on learning about government, specifically the United States government. And so I'll be doing some modeling. And then if there's any time, you can kind of play around too a little bit and do some modeling as well. But I'm going to be looking at the Jamboard. And you can see on the first slide, I just have this kind of reminder of the steps. So list the word that connects to, list words that connect to the topic of US government on sticky notes. You're going to sort the sticky notes into piles of words that relate to one another. And then these are your categories. And then you'll create the semantic map using that keyword, the categories, and the example. So on slide 2, I went ahead and just put on that sticky note. Our topic is the US government, right? And so, thank you. Yep, as they get this open, and then click to the next slide on the Jamboard. There we go. Perfect. We have our US government, and now we can use sticky notes to kind of just list out some other words and phrases that we might think about when we hear that term or that we've been learning about. So for example, I might say, like, I think about Congress. And then I would save. And so now I have one idea here, right? Oh, yeah, someone else too is getting, oh God, yeah, thank you. Is there any other words or phrases that we think about that anyone would like to add? You can drop it in the chat too if you'd like, versus having to unmute, but yep, voters, Senate, yep, democracy, checks and balances. Okay, any other thoughts? I thought about like the president, right? The president. We got a lot going on here. So branches, yep, branch Supreme Court, federalism, services, bills. Yeah, we have lots coming up right now, right? I'm going to add to, like I said, I thought about like the president. And of course, we could always add like the vice president. Okay. Power to make coins. Yep. Treaties. Oh, yep. There's vice president, branches, bill, U.S. Constitution, majority rule. Yep. I think about two like federal agencies, you know, like the FBI and things like that. Federal agencies. I'll add that. Amendments. Yep. Awesome. House of Representatives. I don't know if anyone's added that one yet. Okay. So we got a lot going on. This is great. This is great. So we'll think about now if we were with our students and we had our students with us and we were looking at now all of these words that we had jotted down, right? That connect to US government. Now we can start looking for categories. So obviously too, when we think of the US government, there's a big, right? Thing that comes to mind, of course, is the branches, the 3 branches of government. So that could be categories, right, that are created. There could be potentially maybe some additional categories that we can come up with, right? But as we look at the Jamboard, we can start to kind of like sort them out, right? So if I were thinking about kind of the branches of government, like Congress and the House of Representatives, those, you know, are kind of like, okay, those are legislative, right? So I'm going to sit and I'm going to sort through. The Supreme Court, right, is obviously going to be our judicial branch. And they also evaluate laws. Okay. Oh, and I see too, like the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., right? Like locations, the White House could be added in there. So you would go ahead and sort out, right, each of those and how they kind of connect together. And then just as we had shown you on some of the other examples, you could then put those categories. So you'd have your US government, then you would list your categories such as legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, maybe like we talked about location, or maybe there's some things in here too that are very specific to creating laws, right? Yep, someone sorted together like federal agencies, Capitol building, Washington, D.C. So I can see people right here and right now, right? You're already sorting out into those categories. And then these that we jotted onto our stickies would be like some of the other examples that would be connected to the categories or strands. Okay. So if we want to take a couple minutes, just a couple more minutes to kind of play around a little bit with that. Work on sorting. If you want to try it out on your own on a different page, you can. There's all different pages that just say any of the you try. They're open for you if you want to try out some different ideas. But I see, you know, some people are working on sorting out these different categories that we could create. Take about 1 more minute. All right, if we wrap that up, we can go back to the slides for the slideshow. Yep. So as we said, right, if we had a little more time, we could then go and create that semantic map. So the US government would be in the middle, and then we would have our strands or those categories. So we could have judicial branch, legislative branch, executive branch. We could have like the location, and then we could list out those very specific examples, such as Supreme Court. Under executive branch, you could have president, vice president. I have too, like the word like veto, right? Underneath the location, we had like Washington, D.C., Capitol building. We could have the White House, federal agencies. So all of those very specific examples. Okay. If you could click to the next slide. So how else could we use semantic mapping? So one way, and I should say in math, right, is that we could use it for shapes, right? We know that there is a lot of categorizing of different types of 2D and 3D shapes. So you could use it for categorizing 2D and 3D shapes. You could use types of triangles. In science, you could think about weather and how you could create categories and examples. If you're looking at specifically types of like different animals, like vertebrates, invertebrates, the ecosystems. In social studies, I've used semantic mapping with the Holocaust, and you could use like ancient Egypt. So what else, as you think about what you teach, off the top of your head, what else is something that a topic you could use for semantic mapping? And if you want to drop an idea in the chat, we'd love to hear it. Yeah, awesome. So great science ideas here. Food chains, yep. Oh yeah, ecosystems, relationships. In the cells, yep. If we think about too, if you teach an ELL classroom, you could always choose too, if you're working on like vocabulary for different seasons that we experience in Minnesota. You could use it to categorize different things around the idea of spring or summer, community places, jobs, Yeah, things in different rooms in a house. Perfect. Yep. And then there was a question too. Susan asked, when you do this sorting activity, do you make a copy of the Jamboard for each person, or do they all drag around the same one? I think it depends on where your students are at. If this is something that's relatively new, they could do it together. If this is something that you feel like they can do on their own, they could each have their own Jamboard to do it. Like I said, I've taught in person. I like to do it over a document camera, and then that way I can model too, and we can have a discussion as a class. But then I'm kind of the one sorting, as students are just getting used to the idea of semantic mapping before then I like draw it out. So thinking about the scaffolds that your students might need. Yeah, so some people already too making connections with some of the other strategies from here and how they could connect. Yeah, great. Great ideas. Okay. All right. So if we want to click to the next slide, we are going to hand it over to Amber.
Thank you so much, Kori. Amber.
Well, hello, everybody. So I am going to take you on a journey of looking at a research based strategy for students to practice using academic language in their thinking, but in their oral processing. So if you want to go to the next slide, we're going to talk today about something called thinking classrooms. So I went to the Minnesota Council of Teachers of Mathematics conference this last year, and they talked a lot about this idea of thinking classrooms. And I keep the book next to me all the time. I actually have 2 books, and it's strategies that work well for the so kindergarten level math content, and I use it in my setting. So I am currently working as adult education support in math classes that are designed for students who are not placing into college level math. So I'm currently teaching a college algebra class with students who are taking TABE tests that are usually M's or D's and are usually scoring between a 4th and a 7th grade level on those assessments. So they're coming in with lots of skill gaps. Many are multi-language learners. And so we're working on building academic language and vocabulary, but also in building confidence in using those things in their learning. So a thinking classroom's goal is to create a collaborative and conversational classroom environment where students have to think longer and more deeply about an idea. And so you can actually see on this slide, these are my students. They are noodling away together. So our journey for the next 15 minutes is going to be about how we can use these strategies to get our students talking and thinking and asking questions using that academic vocabulary. So let's go to the next slide. So this slide is really crazy busy, but I wanted to put it in for you. So this slide kind of talks about all the different structures that go into place. So the reason why I love thinking classrooms is not only is it super in line with a lot of our mathematical practices, but it's also really well in line with our ACEs TIF skills about building norms and routines and expectations. And so while there's a lot of stuff that goes into creating a thinking classroom, we're going to focus today on how students are asking questions, how they're answering questions, and then how we ask and answer questions to really bring out that academic vocabulary. So we're going to talk a little bit later if you are interested in learning more, but this is something I'm going to get really excited about. So if I go too fast, please drop something in the chat. So let's go to the next slide. So there are lots of hallmarks to building a thinking classroom. And so for me, I use thinking classrooms from early on. So I have a semester-based course, and I use it from early on with my students, no matter what level content we're talking about, and no matter what we're doing, because we build the expectation that
math is best done with a friend, and some of our best thinking happens when we're working with others. And also the idea about if we can talk about more people, we can talk about our thinking, using precise academic vocabulary, then we actually know and understand it. So this is going to be something that's really important to us. So in our thinking classrooms, we're doing problem solving tasks. So these are not going to be super easy problems. And that could mean a lot of different things based on the students that you have. So for me, I often use these as introduction problems or kind of push problems or some novel kind of problem. So it doesn't look exactly like something we've done, but they should be able to reach and be able to get there. We work on giving minimal text directions because we're working on some listening skills in getting oral directions. Many of our students, my students in particular, want to be somebody's boss someday. And so we are working on listening to directions and being able to follow through. And sometimes we talk about, did I give you good enough directions? Why don't I want to give you more directions? And my students have come to realize that I often will be too helpful when I give too many directions. And so you need to adjust that based on who your students are. Random groups are really important because in the real world, we don't always have super carefully constructed teams. So we do randomized groupings in lots of different ways so that students have to talk to each other and have lots of different ability levels in each group, but everybody in the group has to participate. The other hallmark of a thinking classroom is that there's vertical non-permanent surfaces. So I'm in the classroom, but I have also done this on like Jamboard and things like that. Obviously not as ideal. But when you're in the classroom, having vertical surfaces, there's evidence that that's showing that doing math vertically actually engages different parts of your brain, which is really important for our students. And non-permanent surfaces are shown to be where students are more likely to take risks and try things. And so we've been working on all this academic vocabulary, all these different processes, and they're more willing to try it on and practice something when it doesn't feel as permanent. So my walls have lots of whiteboards on them. You can see this is another one of my groups. We have whiteboards on lots of our walls. And every student is in charge of writing at one point, so we will do multiple problems a day and they have to take turns writing. So everybody is actively engaged. We also work on decentralizing the room. That means that there is no front of the room. I don't stand in the front of the room. I don't give directions from the front of the room. The room becomes a place of learning and engaging and talking and problem solving. So I will stop them and check in with them all over the classroom because the learning is all over. It's not in one centralized place. I already talked about how we share the markers. So there's not one leader, there's not one writer, there's not one author. We are all constructing our learning together. We also work on discussing our thinking. This is where practicing that academic vocabulary becomes absolutely key. So we might have studied it, we might have broken the word apart, we might have done some of these other strategies that you heard about today, and now is the time we have to put it into practice. And I find every single time I do this, I get goosebumps when I hear my students use the academic language, and sometimes for the first time say it out loud in context. And so we're working on some of that risk taking, and then they're able to do so much more than I would have maybe been able to hear from them in any other context. And finally, this takes time. You cannot rush a thinking classroom, which is one of the things that is hard for me when I have a class that is a specific set time. But I always end up trying to schedule more time for the activity or the task than I think I'm going to need. And I will almost always use all the time and want to still use more. So those are just some of the hallmarks. If we go ahead and go to the next slide, one of the things that I think about in terms of academic language and academic vocabulary is communication, oral communication. We have students from lots and lots of different backgrounds with lots and lots of different abilities and goals, not unlike any other adult education classroom. And so one of the things that we've been really working on is looking at how can I make my algebra class, which everybody hates, nobody really wants to take it, and it is usually a barrier for them to be successful in their college program and turn it into something that feels really important. And so one of the things is that we have created thinking classrooms to be a time to practice our professionalism, and like we have created it to be, if you are at work or you are filling out a resume or you are in an interview and they're going to ask you about a time where you had to work in a team and what went well, we want to give you things to talk about. And so we kind of housed it that way. And so in those conversations, we've gotten some really interesting things from students about how they think about problem solving with their peers. And so I wanted to put together a slide that talks about how you can support thinking and conversation with your students. So when you're working with your students in thinking classrooms and then in any other kind of setting where you're wandering around, there are different kinds of questions that your students are going to ask. One question is going to be a proximity question. You're standing next to them, like you're walking by, so they're going to grab you and ask a question. Another kind of question that they're going to ask you is like a stop thinking question. This is when the student is ready to kind of not hold the mental load anymore, and they want you to pick it up. And then a keep thinking question is when a student is trying to keep problem solving and get through, but they're hoping for just something to kind of keep, like, get a little bit more momentum. And so I talk about these kinds of questions with my students and why, when, and how we ask these different kinds of questions. And so we talk about what kind of answers they want from it and what they expect to get and how it helps and promotes their learning. And so we're going to talk in just a few minutes about some of the things that my students came up with on how to ask better questions. And they all come back to academic vocabulary and using specific words, using examples, using reasoning, problem solving. So all of these things that go really hand in hand with our mathematical practices. But in a thinking classroom, you are not supposed to be in charge. You are not supposed to be helping. I have to bite my tongue and find other things to do often, and so that I'm not the person who's engaging with them. So in a thinking classroom, the students are the experts. They have the resources that they need within their group, but also within the larger learning community. And so one of the challenges is that my students maybe haven't been somebody's boss before and don't know how to communicate with somebody else to solve a problem effectively. So one of the things that we have to do with hand in hand with making sure we're using precise vocabulary, we're using meaningful examples, and we're using our problem-solving thinking strategies is we also need to know how to talk to each other. So we have to talk about how do we give each other feedback. So what does that mean? So if you want to tell somebody that you really like their idea, how do you say that in a way that's not, oh, I like that idea, and that it doesn't actually help promote more of our learning? Or if you need to tell somebody that you disagree with them, how can you do that respectfully, but keep the process moving? We also talk about in our classrooms how to encourage participation, because everybody has something that they can add to the group, whether or not they feel like they're the most successful in the room. Everybody has something to add. And in a thinking classroom, everybody's responsible for pulling each other in. So we need to talk about what are some phrases we could use to encourage participation. So an example might be training them, like our students, giving them permission to say things like, Lindsay, I noticed you haven't said anything. Would you like to add something? And giving some sentence stems in there to help them know how to use some of these strategies. Really, when we come into using our clarifying questions, that's when we're going to use our academic language. So when you said over there, did you mean the denominator? Or when you said get rid of that, did you mean clear the decimals? Trying to make sure that you're using precise language and using a reflection activity where we kind of say back to each other what I think we're saying. And that has been incredibly helpful for asking better questions, but also giving each other more feedback and getting us towards where we want to go in our problem solving faster. And then process questions. So our students often know that they need to do, I don't know, I have to do something with the variable is usually comes up in my class quite a bit. And so talking about, okay, so first Then should we try next? Like those kinds of things to keep us going. So when you're supporting that, giving the time where you're modeling how to use this academic language, you're giving sentence stems to use the academic language, and then giving them safe places to practice it. And then also when you see or hear these different kinds of questions from students or these kinds of interactions with their peers, naming it and celebrating it. So I was recently had my formal Q-Comp observation for a thinking classroom, and my observer was super surprised because I would be like, oh, that's a start thinking question, or that's a keep thinking question, or, oh, I'm hearing stop thinking questions. How can we rephrase that? And making that a part of our classroom culture. So if we go to the next slide, I want to show you this is actually, I know it's hard to read, I'm sorry. This is actually what we generated as a class, and we have it up in our classroom. So we have this whiteboard on wheels that we can wheel around, and we collected these in class. And as we hear them, or as we hear better examples, we add to this list. And I found this activity incredibly powerful for my students, but also for myself. So my students, and this is a very like TIFF heavy activity, but we talked about how does this look in the workplace? How are we going to practice it here? And was super fun because we actually then talked about how would we write this on our resume that we know how to do this? We're 7 weeks into the semester now, and we're getting pretty good at this. How would we tell an employer that we can do these things? And so our first category here is stop thinking questions. So remember, these are the questions that students can ask themselves or to you or to a volunteer that is trying to let go of their mental load. And so we came up with a list of things that are examples of stop thinking questions that we often get in class. So things like, is this right? Or do we have to learn this? Am I ever going to use this again? Is this on the test? How do I do this? These are questions that my students are recognizing that their brain stops engaging when they ask these kinds of questions, because as soon as I answer it, their brain doesn't have to hold anything else and they move on. And we're trying to get them to do more with it. Keep thinking questions are questions that are going to, that I can use as a prompt or that they can use with each other to kind of nudge the process along. So what you're going to notice in these kinds of questions here, that it is oftentimes they're not going to necessarily have a really well thought out answer for these questions, but it's one that's going to, like, you could ask, smile a little bit, and then be quiet and walk away and let them noodle. So when they're doing a thinking classroom, there's usually a problem on the board and they're just working through it to the best of their ability. Like I said, it's usually something that is a novel problem. So it's not quite something we've done before, but it's maybe the next step. And so I'm often in these moments trying to just nudge them. What do you think? What should we try? Does that always work? Is there a time when that wouldn't work? And then really trying to push them to talk to each other. So, I wonder what would happen if you looked at what group 4 is doing right now and notice their third step. It looks different than yours. What's happening there? Or what do you think is going on there? And then I usually walk away and let them go at it. Then we talked about those ideas of feedback. And so we've got those down there. We've talked about those quite a bit. But the bottom corner is the one I really want to focus on. And that is our students have decided that they want to call each other in on the conversation and instead of calling each other out. And so that is going to be a really important strategy to bring out that ability to take risks and to do things that maybe they wouldn't normally want to do. So on the next slide, I wanted to give you an example of what kind of a novel problem might look like. So you'll notice here that it's not a super crazy prompt. I'm just asking students to take this V and to put numbers in it. Now, if we had more time, I would let you wrestle with this problem because there's tons of ways you can do it. But there is a link here that Gail just put into the chat. I really want to encourage you, if you're interested in trying to figure out how you can utilize thinking classrooms to get them to practice these academic vocabulary in context, the link that she put in has examples. It has videos, it has prompts, and it has a lot of teacher materials that you can adapt. So for me, it's hard to always come up with a really great idea. And with this, there are so many resources out there. And then I would give students a bunch of time to work on this, and this is all they would have from me. And we would be able to see lots and lots of really cool things. So once again, just to kind of highlight, the prompt is that you're going to take numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you're going to put them in the shape of a V so that the arms have the same total. And so if we go to the next slide, since I'm just about out of time, I wanted to come up with some keep thinking prompts, because I think sometimes it gets to be tricky to think about, like, what would you say in these kinds of moments? And so all of these keep thinking prompts actually came right from the activity that we pulled it from. So for you, if it's something new that you're trying, you don't have to keep all that mental load. But look at how these prompts have so many opportunities for students to use their academic vocabulary in their explanations. So I really want to leave you with a thought of how can you encourage the use of academic vocabulary in the classroom by being less helpful, by stepping out of the front of the room and letting students go more. But how can you then support them in getting that going? So if this is something that's interesting to you, we are going to be having a Building Thinking Classrooms book group. So it is going to be starting this week. We don't have a lot to read for the first week, so if you get in late, it's not a big deal. But we're going to be spending several months looking at how does Building Thinking Classrooms work in the adult education classroom. And so we're going to just get together and have kind of a more casual walk through the books. Lindsay put the link in the chat. I really want to encourage you. It's a low stakes. It's the third Friday of every month. It's 2 hours. We're going to get together. We're going to talk. We're going to noodle. And we're going to look at how does this work in our context and how can we learn from each other. There'll be lots of opportunities to do math, to talk math, and to think math. But we really want to encourage people from all levels to engage with this. So sorry I talked so long, but I am so excited to take your thinkings and put them into these thinking classrooms. So Lindsay, I think we're ready to jump into some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Amber. Appreciate it. Just move along to the next slide here. Yeah, I think we're ready for some questions. I'll let people think on what it is they would like to ask and some announcements, but let's pause here. Questions do you have for either Amber or any of the other panelists? What is bubbling up that you would like this opportunity to ask your colleagues? And I just want to extend a warm thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you so much to Susan and Jessica and Kori and Amber for sharing with us. Susan is asking, what kind of assessments does a thinking classroom use, Amber?
Ooh, that is a fantastic question. And there's
is.
actually an entire section of the textbook about how to do assessment with the thinking classroom. And so I use thinking classrooms for a lot of different kinds of assessment. I use it at the beginning of a unit for some informal anecdotal note kind of assessment. I also am using ungrading in my classrooms now. So we are not giving out traditional A, B, C, and D grades. We are actually using standards-based grading. So I have a rubric of some of the standards that we would do and some of the hallmarks of what that would look like. And so we're kind of checking those off, but there's almost always a follow-up task that goes with it, which provides more independent assessment. So that's something we're going to be digging in to in our book group as well.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Building Thinking Classrooms book group. I do encourage people to take part. And yes, Atlas will provide the book, and you're not too late, so join us. And a big thanks to Justine Hill, who's joining us from Faribault to coordinate that. Other questions? We do have a handful of announcements, and I will go ahead and flip through those, and then we'll see if any other questions have come about while I do that. I don't know if Astrid is here or would want to say any more about these. I know she was here earlier. I don't know if she was able to stay. There are some monthly high school equivalency coffee talks coming up the 4th Tuesday of the month, and you can join your colleagues from the Department of Ed and other adult education programs to talk about high school equivalency and all things related. So you can see the event calendar for that. Brandy Logan from MDE will be running those. So if GED and HiSET are on your mind and you want to talk about it, this is the place. So join us for those. Find my cursor here, just a sec. There we go. There is a trauma-informed practices study circle coming up. Andrea Eckelberger will be running that for us, and it is starting soon. Registration deadline is the 23rd, so just 10 days to get that on your calendar and get the application filled out. Registration is due just next week, so you can see the dates there. So starting them on the 8th of March. That'll run every couple weeks. Just 4 meetings. There's a little bit of reading in between. This is a good one. If you were at the Language and Literacy Institute and had a chance to see the Thursday morning speaker, Lucy Rosario, talk about healing-centered practices and organizational culture around being an empathetic, I would say, school and program, and want to learn more about how to do that, I would suggest you maybe look into that and maybe bring a friend. And thank you. Instead of having individual links for all the things for this particular webinar, there were so many, we just created one doc and put them all in that. So Gail, thank you for dropping that. And then we have an ACES TIF webinar coming up, more than alphabet soup. And a big thanks to Carly and Stephanie Summers for putting this one together. This is part 2. It's okay if you didn't make it to part 1. This one's coming up. Gosh, is that this week? Yes, it is Thursday, February 15th. And we'll be digging into the TIF, of course, the Transitions Integration Framework, particularly the new and improved lesson plans that were developed. Maybe you were part of that TIF 2.0 task force that put together some really excellent lesson plans and helped us think more deeply about social emotional learning and diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to the TIF. And we'll be showcasing some of that work on Thursday. If you live and work in the Metro, you may want to join us. I'm for sure you want to join us on March 1st in Roseville at the Doubletree. This is our first Metro Regional we've been able to hold since March of 2020. So join us for that event. Registration opened today, so you can register now. Yes, woohoo indeed, Lindsay, we're excited about this one. Evidence-based reading instruction. There's a new course coming to Canvas. Christine Kelly is working away on that. This will be a pilot opportunity for, we're just moving some really interesting content from links from some other sources, from an old Moodle course, from Christine Kelly's head, just into a new Canvas course and a cohort opportunity and some synchronous webinars that will cover the 4 components of reading. More info to come in February, so watch your newsletter on Tuesdays for that. Applications will be due on the 22nd of March and it'll run in April and May. So if you teach reading and want to know the ins and outs, join us for that. Adult Career Pathways event is coming up on April 19th. It's going to be 9 to 1 or so a half day. It's all virtual, so you can do it in your jammies. So join us for that. If you work in Adult Career Pathways, if you know what an IET is or would like to, join us. Or if you know what an SSLO is or would like to, join us. Canvas courses, ABE foundations, CCRS foundations, ACES foundations, so much foundation work is now available in the Canvas. So lots of self-paced, personalized feedback available in those courses. So if you are new-ish to the field and need to kind of get your bearings, figure out what's what the heck's going on with CCRS, what's this ACES stuff all about, this is a great place to start. These are self-paced. You can kind of do it on your own, when you have time, work through some of this work. That's foundational to the work of adult basic ed. So thank you. I don't see any other questions that have come up. I don't know, Lindsay, if you see anything or is there anything else you want to say, but I would love for our panelists to come back on camera and just give us a nice wave here. We always hire such brilliant people to do stuff for us. Thank you. we will stay on for a moment, but I think we'll go ahead and close the recording now.